I will be presenting an overview of some of what I consider to be the most valuable or surprising points of my dissertation that I thought would fit nicely into the aims of this conference. The title of my thesis is Between Classicism and Orientalism, the Reception of Ancient Cypriot Sculpture between 1860 and 1900. My work explores this theme through a historiographical lens and brings together methodologies from the fields of art history, museum studies, and reception studies. I show here just a few especially important models for my own work. What initially drew me to the subject of Cypriot sculpture was a fascination with the apparent endless problems it caused for our predecessors, especially those who hoped to sort it neatly into a prescribed category. These categories were often either stylistic or geographic, and served as a base for conceptions of the ancient world and the development of progressively sophisticated forms of art and representation that were seen to have reached a peak in the classical Greek style. Anyone who hoped to achieve this sort of neat narrative was certainly baffled by Cypriot sculpture. Nevertheless, some chose to take up the challenge and engage this sculpture in their excavations, writings, or galleries. The individuals are too numerous to name today, but I gestured to my slides so that you can get a sense of some of the perhaps unexpected work I compared and analyzed, and indeed found to be rich in its consideration of Cypriot art, having considerable influence on what was produced later. Some of the familiar figures whose work on the island I considered, not only through informal field reports and published works and essays, but also importantly through correspondence, especially what's held at the British Museum. Unfortunately, this won't be the focus of my remarks today, but I do treat it in detail in my dissertation, and it's very, very fun stuff. I focused on Cypro-archaic and Cypro-classical votive sculpture, to some extent because its discovery made quite a splash that can be traced in popular materials, but also because the combination of stylistic elements present in these works was so complex and unfamiliar as to present a real challenge to anyone desperate to tell a teleological narrative, or to display their works logically within an encyclopedic collection. And on the other modern end, I chose to concentrate on the second half of the 19th century, as this was, for better or for worse, a fascinating, wild, and productive time, marking the birth of a clearly delineated field dedicated to Cypriot studies. The major questions I sought to answer, and again to bring these to the audience for you to consider today, were as follows, and I'll just kind of run through these very quickly. How did this discovery of ancient Cypriot sculpture challenge 19th century scholars and institutions? What solutions did individuals present? Why did Britain and France develop different perspectives on the island's material culture? And finally, why should this matter for us today? So let's go ahead and return to the 19th century, taking a moment to appreciate the context. The lessons of the Enlightenment and delight in the classical Greek ideal loomed large in the imaginations and educations of our counterparts working 2 centuries ago. The celebration of classical Greek models, especially in the realms of art, philosophy, and literature, cannot be understated. Preoccupied with ideas of purity and order, for the wealthy and educated classes who controlled the tides of taste, Cyprus was little more than a recurring footnote of history, an island on the periphery rather than at the center of greatness. The political and social upheaval of the late 18th and early 19th centuries in Europe and America made room for new ways of understanding the ancient world. Post-Enlightenment scholars incorporated pre-classical and non-classical material into their studies, giving them a wider geographic focus while extending them further back into the past. Scholars and amateurs, including Austin Henry Layard and Paul-Émile Botha, traveled to the Ottoman Empire seeking traces of biblical kings and their empires, and hoping to prove the historicity of these accounts. After their magnificent finds were welcomed into European museums in the mid-19th century, explorations of regions previously considered uninteresting, unappealing, or unworthy of study began in earnest. Both scholars and the public were also increasingly besotted by quote-unquote new antiquities, and were allowing their curiosity to lead them into a more distant past and toward an extended geography. It is into this same moment that we first see a widespread engagement with ancient Cypriot sculpture, from the 1860s as the era of its initial large-scale discovery, and in the 1870s and 1880s, where we see the emergence of debates surrounding Cypriot art and archaeology. As I've said, those writing at this time told the history of art as a story of progress. Though never executed as a display scheme, an 1845 watercolor by James Stephanoff entitled Assemblage of Works of Art from the Earliest Period to the Time of Phidias illustrates how such a model could find expression in visual form. Incorporating works from around the world, the foundations of this assemblage are furnished by sculptures from Central America, as well as by Hindu and Buddhist works. In the center are works from Persia, Egypt, and Etruria. Marble sculpture from Greece and Lycia follows, with the agona leading the eye to what we are to understand as the apex of artistic achievement, of course, the Parthenon marbles. While Stephanoff's title would suggest that the works are arranged simply chronologically, with the earliest at the bottom and the more recent at the top, they are in reality arranged according to prescribed aesthetic judgments and ideas about the relative merits of each culture's artistic traditions. This theoretical hierarchy forms the backdrop against which works from Cyprus entered the scene, where scholars eagerly noted the visual links between Cypriot sculpture and sculpture from Greece, Egypt, Phoenicia, and Assyria. The events, publications, and intellectual climate in the 19th century profoundly and lastingly shaped three fundamental aspects of the study of Cypriot sculpture, guiding approaches that persist in today's scholarship. First, this period saw the development of vocabularies and chronologies to describe and classify a Cypriot sculptural style that focused on, quote, influences, and often offered trenchant critiques of its, quote, derivative aesthetic. Second, this scholarship initiated a tendency to label elements of dress and iconography attested outside Cyprus as foreign, linking them with periods of domination by various Mediterranean powers. Finally, 19th century authors hoping to advertise the novelty of the Cypriot style identified symbols and costumes unique to the island as representing a native Cypriot or Etio-Cypriot identity, somehow more in line with an essential Cypriot spirit. Early treatments of Cypriot sculpture and classifications of its style and aesthetics thus launched a series of debates in which its material culture was used as a tool to measure foreign influence and interaction with both East and West, a fate reinforced by the island's fraught political circumstances, both then and now. The warring impulses to align Cyprus with Greece or the Near East, or instead to emphasize its special, independent nature, were activated in various and complex ways as the island moved from Ottoman rule to British rule and claimed independence, and then became embroiled in a political division that persists today. Inquiries into the nature of the Cypriot identity and appraisal of foreign authorship, so often introduced in the early scholarship on ancient Cyprus, are therefore highly sensitive topics and remain so when broached today, no matter the nationality or allegiances of the scholar. Try as scholars might to be objective, evaluators and narrators of the past, antiquity is continually recrafted in the image of those who study it. Turning briefly to museums. The Louvre is the first museum to display a marked commitment to collecting Cypriot objects, beginning in the 1860s, embracing the culture as a category of the Oriental. The British Museum followed, increasing its pace of Cypriot purchases in the 1870s and leading its own excavations in the 1880s and 90s, but generally viewing Cypriot art as belonging instead to the Greek tradition. Here I show two nearly identical sculptures that found very different departmental homes within the Louvre and British museums. At the Louvre, Cypriot sculpture was initially exhibited alongside Phoenician and Assyrian material, joining the Département des Antiquités Orientales upon its founding in 1881. While at the British Museum, Cypriot works belonged instead to the Department of Greek and Roman Antiquities, established in 1860. These very different methods of classifying Cypriot culture can be best appreciated in the context of each museum's wider collections. In the case of the Louvre, Cypriot works could be appreciated in context not only of other ancient sculptures, but also with the visual landscapes of 19th century French Orientalist paintings. At the British Museum, the paths to works of the Greek Roman department had been paved by the East Greek monuments that the museum had previously acquired, including the Harpy Tomb and Nereid Monument from Xanthos and the mausoleum at Halicarnassus. Further, the installation of a British government on Cyprus in 1878 affected Western European perceptions of the island's dominant cultural heritage. Often, scholars who evaluated the Cypriot tradition extrapolated from pseudo-anthropological observations on the political, religious, and ethnic identities of its inhabitants, not only in antiquity, but ultimately as they were understood in the contemporary period. For scholars, and especially those based in the UK, ancient Cyprus was thus an adaptable concept that readily shifted, more Oriental under Ottoman rule and more Greek after the British had arrived. We also observe Cyprus being stretched every which way in broader treatments about the history of art and its stylistic development, where the perception of Cyprus's dominant cultural heritage was flexible, but its role as a precursor to classical Greece was relatively consistent. These publications promoted a model of Mediterranean artistic development in which Cyprus acted as a conduit between Assyria, Egypt, Phoenicia, and Greece, absorbing and passing on ideas from east to west with little or no agency of its own. Here's an illustration of how that could work. The directions of supposed influence could run from south to north, coming from Egypt and extending through Cyprus up to the pinnacle that you find in classical Athens. Or they could run from from east to west, of course, with the Assyrian relief that you see being sort of a predecessor of Cyprus and Cypriot sculpture. Other scholars insisted on the unique and absolute genius of classical Greek sculpture, and their affinity did not extend to Cyprus. Elements of hairstyle, headdress, and costume were highlighted, and in this way, an aesthetic ranking and chronology was formed. This chronology found an anchoring in periods of foreign rule or dominance. Here's an illustration of how that has worked. And I think we're all very familiar with this type of chronology. Yet there were also other, even less generous ways of viewing Cypriot sculpture, pushing it further into the past rather than as a link to the future. But this wasn't all bad news, neither for the field nor for us. Some authors suggested Cypriot art was related to the Etruscan or Mycenaean styles. Mycenae, which was in some publications considered a distinct region, and in others grouped with Oriental or Greek, provides a useful Bronze Age foil to my study of Iron Age Cyprus. Writing in 1883, Arthur Alexander Johann Mischhofer, a German classical archaeologist, argued that Mycenaean art was a type of Mischkunst, barbaric, not trusted to untangle itself. Indeed, similar anxieties were expressed about Cypriot art, above all by scholars who were frustrated with what they perceived as a mixing of styles, as they attempted to cleanly separate which elements belonged to which culture. Still, efforts to untangle so-called Oriental, including Cypriot, art actually drove further studies of the Near East, contrary to what might otherwise be assumed. Explorations of Oriental art were to be made in the service of Greek art, and Cypriot art was in the perhaps unique position of being able to answer questions about both traditions. Scholars' increasingly confident rejection of Cypriot art as a type of Greek art served to dull the initial excitement that had surrounded the excavation of materials from the 1860s and 70s, providing justification for both veiled criticisms and outright attacks. By the 1880s, scholars began to rely on problematic, loaded vocabulary that emphasized the, quote, foreign, of course by which they meant non-Greek or non-Western, nature of the ancient Cypriot people and their artistic traditions. Cypriot art was labeled as derivative, a sentiment that would endure for the rest of the century. The logical underpinnings of the precursor model slowly fell away, leaving Cypriot sculpture as a problematic rather than useful legacy, a nuisance that made highlighting the potential Eastern origins of classical Greece an awkward task. That Cypriot sculpture failed to gain traction as a branch of so-called Greek art should come as no surprise. After all, discussions of Cypriot art were, at this time and at their root, discussions about what Greek art was not, rather than what it was, or even what it had been. As British classicist Jane Ellen Harrison plainly stated in her 1885 survey of Greek art, we can only see what was really original in Greek art when we have eliminated what was borrowed from others, end quote. In discussing the Cypriot tradition, authors thus carefully signposted the traits that separated the style from the Greek. The Cypriot style offered a convenient way to delineate the aesthetic border between East and West. Still, the very fact that scholars were interested in investigating this border meant that they gave Cypriot sculpture attention it might otherwise not have received. To wrap up, I couldn't resist giving you one last highlight of my historiographic tour here. So around 1900, scholars' attention shifts yet again with the new discoveries in the pre-classical Aegean, especially of the Mycenaean and Minoan cultures. Crete effectively replaces Cyprus as the intermediary between East and West, as the missing link or precursor to Hellenic style and excellence. We see this in the art historical surveys, and indeed, Mycenaean and Minoan cultures still perform this work in that they are used in our own surveys as a sort of teaser, a prequel to real, to quote, real Greek art. It certainly gave me pause to see how faithfully we replicate many of the arguments and narratives our predecessors have made over 100 years ago. Inertia is an extremely powerful force. Thank you.